Top 10 Pikmin bosses. That's it. Let's go. You can tell this list is going to be stacked with bizarre, occasionally off-putting creatures when Empress Bulblax is only barely scraping in at number 10. And I do mean barely. This was a really close race between the Empress and Groovy Longlegs. Both stand out for very obvious reasons, and while I was tempted to throw Groovy up here just so Pikmin 4 could have another rep it was sorely lacking, I'm still sour over the fact it only appeared once across the entire game, side modes included. So while it is indeed a fun, quirky one-off fight, it's a bit too easy to forget about when you zoom out and look at all of Pikmin 4. But please, I'm totally up for fighting Emperor Bulblax and Smoky Prog for the 7th time. Empress Bulblax, meanwhile, is certainly not forgettable. I don't think I could forget her if I tried. She's Pikmin's ideal solid if simple first boss that does a great job showing the player what they can and can't get away with. In the first few days, any enemies you come across will easily fall to basic bum rushing or sneak attacks without much problem. The Empress bucks that trend thanks to her massive health pool. She is going to retaliate at a few points no matter what, and if you get too greedy or careless, she'll shake off your squad to one side and right where they need to be for a fresh batch of Pikmin pancakes. That roll might be slow, but that only makes you feel worse when Pikmin die to it, all because you didn't respect the lady and give her some space. Seriously, this takes the whole step on me mommy thing to a whole nother level. Speaking of mommies, the Empress is all too willing to get her kids involved, cause yeah. I'm no stranger to bosses that give birth to more enemies along the way, but I've never seen one quite as casual about it as this one. And these little tygs are not to be underestimated. Sure, they're not very fast in their non-existent feet, and they die in one hit, but they also eat any Pikmin they catch instantly, making these newborn grubs terrifyingly efficient if they close in on you. Later fights with the Big Mama are often a test of managing multiple targets without getting overwhelmed. Fight your way to the Empress's front half. Agitate her to the point of murdering her own children. And don't get cocky. You lose your rhythm and she'll serve you a fat slice of humble pie. Squash flavored. The only reason she isn't any higher is just because I'm not a fan of her final fights in both 2 and 4, where she starts bringing down massive insta-kill boulders, which often feel pretty cheap in comparison to her other attacks. Also, there's this nonsense in 4 where she's basically half the boss arena. You'd think an Empress could afford better housing. Alright, we gotta stop for a second to have a serious conversation. I know some of you remembered what happened back in 2017, and we need to address it. Regardless of who you are and what walk of life you're on, I think we can agree that Hey Pikmin can't hurt you anymore. Sure, it wasn't what anyone really wanted, but Pikmin's still moving along just fine. It's not like the series is dead in the water like a lot of us were fearing. Of course, that leaves us to look at the game on its own merits, and there isn't much. Not to say it's an awful game, but there's very little I can look back on and fondly remember. The big exception, however, are the bosses. Most of Hey Pikmin is bogged down by the slower speed of everything and the lack of any potential for multitasking, but these faults are almost impossible to notice during boss encounters, where the beast of the hour is your sole focus. All of them utilize the 2D perspective for some decently fun scraps that do stand apart from the other game's fights, and I do appreciate that. I had a few choices in mind, but I think the most fun Hey Pikmin boss also happens to be the one they'd have the hardest time replicating a mainline title. That being Queen Shearwig. Okay, this is cool. Up until the 4th game, Pikmin has famously been allergic to more vertical level design, so imagine my shock and utter delight when a little trip to Leaf Swirl Lagoon gives us an aerial fight against this army of Shearwigs. And I say good. Little bastards have had it coming since 2001. The fight itself is not very complicated. You're slowly descending down a tree with the help of your winged Pikmin and have to fend off the queen and her followers as they descend upon you and go in for attacks. It plays a lot like a 2D top-down space shooter, which I could see being a bit too far removed from Pikmin's usual gameplay, but I think it's fun and frantic enough to get a pass. It reminds me a lot of a battle with another Flying Monarch boss that may or may not pop up later, and hey, it worked for me there and it works well here too. I only wish I could say that more often about this game.
Oh jeez, now there's a metal version of the pushover? And it's got a gun.
Oh boy, talk about a complete reinvention. Call me crazy, but Beady Longlegs is probably my favorite non-final boss from the first game. I don't know, I just think it's pretty neat. It's undeniably memorable, and it does manage to be a lot tougher than most other bosses without straight up being a dick. And clearly Nintendo thought so too, seeing as it kept getting family members introduced with each new installment. We got the hairy one, the 80s one, and the BBC. Big black creature. but my personal favorite has to be the manid legs. This is definitely the most different of the arachnorbs. Bro can't even stomp on Pikmin because its legs are too spindly, but that's okay. Every skipped leg day went towards a degree in cybernetics. The manid legs is half spider, half robot, and all lethal, and that's thanks to the giant machine gun it has stashed away in its underbelly. I can't tell you how simultaneously terrifying and also kinda exhilarating it is when that laser sight comes out and follows you with extreme prejudice. I like a Pikmin boss that can put me on the run for more than 5 seconds at a time, and Mal certainly qualifies. Disrespect that sideline and you'd better make peace with your soldiers, cause someone's gonna die to this massive volley of energy bullets. Much like the other long legs, you fight in a very stop-and-go manner, but less stompy and more shooty, and I dig it. Ducking behind cover just before the barrage is satisfying, and I actually like the environmental changes between encounters, like fighting it in water or having breakable walls to put some extra pressure on you to finish things quickly. I do have to dock at some points for how easily Ochi can outrun its assaults, because this killing machine somehow doesn't understand the concept of leaving your shots, but I also can't deny it's still pretty threatening in 4. One shot on Ochi and it would have been like shooting fish in a barrel for this artillery-toting arachnid. But hey, I'm awesome, so that didn't happen. Don't shoot my dog. Simple as that. I love myself a good mirror match boss. Then again, I feel like most people do. Sure, facing giant monsters or lumbering oafs is fun in its own right, but I've always got time for a foe more on your level. Same weight class with a lot of the same abilities and attacks. It's a great way to flush out any boss roster. First thing that comes to my mind when looking at this trope are fights from Kingdom Hearts and Sonic, and those have the added benefit of often making them big players in the story, so it feels like a real satisfying grudge match between equals when it finally happens. Pikmin is yet to put in a true rival battle, at least until Pikmin 5, where they'll say, fuck it, you can beat up Louie this time, but for now, that itch is scratched well enough by the Scornet Maestro. It's about time we got to Pikmin 3, which is probably my favorite in the series for boss battles. Where 2 had plenty of rematches and twisted, if occasionally tired takes on classic encounters, 3's main bosses, barring one, are completely original, and each feels like a real huge event in the game. Designs are fresh and interesting, attacks and strategies are a tad more involved, the biomes you face each one in are scenic and memorable, and even these little cutscenes of the Predator popping up and dying help them feel just a bit more cinematic than what came before. It all points to there being a lot more effort put into these compared to the average boss in Pikmin's 1, 2, and 4. And that brings us to the Scornet Maestro. If I was ranking these bosses on design and concept, she'd be right at the tippy top. This bizarre insect covered in feathers that opens its slender beak to reveal strings, that it plays like a harp to control lesser Scornets. Basically what would happen if someone took birds and the bees a bit too literally. It's up there as one of my favorite creature designs in the series, and thankfully comes packaged with a fight that's just as unique. The queen herself is entirely harmless, but it's easy to forget that when she's orchestrating her own battalion of 100 Scornets for both offense and defense. Her troops will swat away any attempted attacks while they just hover around, meaning you'll only get your chance after she gets first strike. These attacks range from large linear sweeps to rapid-fire projectiles to the surrounding circle that requires playing some breakout to escape from. And while they're usually pretty easy to dodge, it can be nerve-wracking when some of your Pikmin get caught, since you can actually save them, but you're trying to spot a select few offending drones in a massive swarm, so better hurry up. This is the closest we've gotten to a Captain v Captain fight, and I find it to be a refreshing change of pace after 2.5 games of mostly just doing the whole giant towering creature thing. I do wish it had a bit more health though. It's not hard to 2-cycle the Maestro, and that doesn't really do this fight justice since you can often just beat it before it uses each attack formation. Still, for how different she is from every other boss, it more than makes up for the somewhat lacking execution. Hopefully we meet more like her. Pikmin very rarely employs setup for its bosses. It makes sense, you're pretty much exclusively fighting predators whose habitat you stumble into because I kinda need that, bro. So they'll pop in, instantly get into a fight, and die for their trouble. And giving a Pikmin boss a place in the narrative would be difficult since Pikmin really doesn't have an antagonist, just an unforgiving planet and its circle of life. That's not to say it can't be done though. After all, who could forget the literal cold opening of Pikmin 3? Getting Charlie and his half-dozen brain cells to grips with the situation, learn the basics of handling Pikmin, and start exploring the region to make things right... Oh. Or he'll just get attacked by some random creature within the first 5 minutes of his crash landing. That's kinda crazy. Across the first 2 games, our captains have been stranded and they've been separated, but they've never been straight up eaten before. It's not a good feeling. Granted, that feeling does quickly go away as you start the game proper in bright sunny locations with Alf and Brittany, who are very likable characters, especially since they're not being digested. But that feeling makes its return when you land in that same snowy landscape and find yourself retreading on familiar ground. Oh, there's definitely a fight coming my way. Better turn on the lights. Look at this thing. That's a face only the darkness could love. The Behemoth Phosbat, which I will now call Venomoth just to annoy people, is more of a puzzle boss than anything else. You face it in this incredibly dark cave where it'll trail behind Predator style, going for cheap shots. You can tell from its formal introduction that Venomoth can handle bright lights, which is very much unlike a typical moth, but let's be real, since when do wildlife in these games behave typically? Fortunately, the cave is full of those simple wiring circuit kits you'd find in an elementary school, so you use your yellows to finish those circuits and light up the place, giving you both room to breathe and an opening to attack Venomoth if it happens to be nearby. By the end of it, things definitely pick up, with you running out of small light bulbs, Venomoth taking a page out of Empress Bulborg's parenting guide and getting her kids involved, and you needing to build a bridge to activate the final light bulb to finish the job. Oh, and Charlie's still alive. Yippee! No cutscenes can harm you anymore, Captain. Pikmin 1 has bosses, right? I think we can all agree on that much. I actually like them for how big of a deal they are to players, while the game itself doesn't really do anything to dress them up. I mean, if you encountered a bear or an alligator in the wild, it's not like dramatic music would start playing as they make a grand entrance. They're a predator, you're on their turf, and shit is probably gonna go downhill fast. Pikmin 1 is much the same, which does give its bosses a unique vibe, but they might be a bit too understated to put on this list. But hey, I wouldn't be talking about this game if it had nothing worth considering. Come on down to the final trial for your 9 to 5 appointment with the Emperor. In my eyes, there hasn't been a bad Pikmin final boss so far, and they had it pretty good right from the get-go. You could say a lot, if not all the bosses I've talked about so far are a bit gimmicky in one way or another, but the Emperor Bulblax takes that trend and body slams it into the dirt. There's no unnatural abilities, no fear tactics, and no extra help. The Emperor Bulblax is just a massive Bulborb with a ton of health and enough devastating attacks to make you feel very vulnerable and very small. Most enemies and bosses have something I'd call a kill limit, where even if you're in the absolute worst possible position and take the brunt of an attack, you won't actually lose as many Pikmin as you'd think, with only a few infamous exceptions. As the first game's final boss, the Bulblax has no such limitations, and both his tongue and squash attacks can theoretically party wipe you if you're not taking his Royal Highness seriously. Thankfully, that adhesive tongue of his is also his biggest weakness, as he can easily be baited into lapping up a bomb rock to give yourself a few precious seconds to attack without danger. That's not even the best way of stunning him though. If you time a bomb rock just as the glutton goes in for a lick, you'll blast his tongue right back into his stupid face, where you'll have even more time to chip away at him. Plus, you won't even have to sacrifice a yellow. It's very hard to pull off consistently, but it is unbelievably satisfying when you get it just right. He's made more appearances since the first game to varying degrees of success, but leave it to Pikmin 4 to put the Emperor back on his throne by having both the smaller, less threatening grubs from 2 and a few of the gigantic titans straight out of the first game, with the Piclopedia clarifying that these are both the same species, with the former being juvenile emperors, while the behemoths are the result of an emperor living for a very long time, granting them the title of Sovereign Bulblax. Double points for working in a word like sovereign. I don't think I've heard that word since high school. Obviously, they're still a big threat, and while you do have way more options at your disposal than you did 22 years ago, he's just so tanky that it will shrug off most attempts to cheese it. Even the more broken things in this game, like Ochi rushes and Ice Pikmin freezing, will barely phase it. Not only that, but it can now roar as a means of putting you at a disadvantage if you stay too close, since it'll send your entire party scurrying around in a panic, forcing you to take time to get back in formation while he continues Frenching your troops. Disgusting. We've definitely had a few bosses I like more since, but I still have a great deal of respect for the Sovereigns. They're the peak of PNF 404 in terms of natural strength and ferocity, and I look forward to testing myself against it every time I get the opportunity. All this for what's effectively a basketball-sized bullfrog. Now that's a terrifying thought. They're the peak of PNF 404 in terms of natural strength and ferocity. Well, depends on how you see this guy. this just keeps getting weirder. Pikmin certainly has its larger than average share of strange looking enemies, but most of them are still relatable and understandable in their own way. Like how the Snagrets are bird heads on snake bodies, or how the armored Maudad is just a funky looking centipede. That all gets Nova blasted out the window with this abstract mess of living Earth. Pikmin 3's Quaggled Meyerclops. Okay, first of all, incredible name. Second of all, the fuck? Just the introduction to this thing is foreboding enough. You're so dead set in trying to find Louis after he stole your food and bailed that you almost don't realize what you're walking into as you cross over into the farthest corner of the Garden of Hope. You enter and, hey, it's a thing stuck inside a crystal on a little hill. That's pretty neat. Maybe we can eat it. But then you get this cutscene with the same pace and feel of a good monster reveal in a horror movie. The music starts to stir faster and faster as this gross fleshy eyeball on the stalk slowly begins to open up. Next thing you know, this crime against nature unearths itself as it dawns on you that you somehow have to kill a continent. The first thing that stands out about the Meyerclops besides the everything is the arena you fight it in. The size is one thing, especially since the boss itself still manages to take up a good third of it at any given time, but then there's the terrain. Mud. Doesn't sound like a big deal, but with Mother Gaia's deformed stepchild stomping and splashing about, it means water hazards that will come and go, giving blue Pikmin some legitimate usage that they're sorely lacking elsewhere in the game, and giving this battle some dynamic environmental changes. Kinda like with the sand-belching Mirror Slug, but a lot more threatening. The water alone is worrisome, but then you have to deal with the Acre's actual attacks. Its massive hooves have the potential to crush large amounts of Pikmin if you aren't paying attention, and that stomping only gets faster and more erratic after you break the remaining chunk of crystal. You've got to topple the natural disaster by attacking its feet, which will give you your chance to first destroy the crystal, and then start going after its creepy fruit brain. But just in case you thought this specimen was way too normal still, it's got one last defensive measure in the form of this rainbow-colored slime tongue that'll poke out to make sweeping licks at your Pikmin. In my not-so-professional opinion, this is officially not normal. For real though, I love this boss. Admittedly, the design and raw unfiltered bizarre factor are carrying a lot of weight, but that fight does make you work for it, which you'd hope for as it is the penultimate boss in 3. And fittingly, this Colossus, both natural and unnatural, is the gatekeeper of far darker, far greater cosmic horrors both in the game itself and for this countdown. Don't you love it when things work out like that? Man, do you guys remember the sensationalism surrounding this one? I mean, it's still definitely there, but back around the early 2010s, there were a solid few years when the submerged castle, and specifically the water wraith, was considered one of the scariest things from a non-horror game. And that somehow even spilled over into this section of the game being hated by a fair amount of people. And I'm not here to judge anybody for their opinion, but I am glad that we've largely moved past this and can acknowledge just how cool this part of the game is. The tricky challenge is having to justify why the Water Wraith is one of my favorite Pikmin bosses, when most of the reason I love it is thanks to the level it comes from, and not so much the fights you have with it. But I think we can all agree that you can't really talk about one without the other. So let's take a minute to zoom out and discuss the series' most iconic dungeon, the Submerged Castle. Even before jumping in, something does feel off about it in a way no other hole in 2 does. Because it's, well, submerged, you can only enter with blue Pikmin, which is pretty intimidating since the cave has every flavor of hazard. Right from the first subfloor, that intimidation turns into genuine unease thanks to a collection of little things. The dark and dreary environment, the eerie minimalistic music that drones on, and how difficult it is by first floor standards with dangerous enemies and fire just everywhere. They even include a geyser as an immediate escape option, the dead ringer that this place is in no way somewhere you want to be. Unfortunately, the cold, uncaring vice of capitalism waits for no man, nor vegetable, nor gross, deformed, flaming bulborb. So we press on. And hey, I just found a perfectly intact chocolate donut down here. I reckon I'm prepared for anything. Run. Talk about a complete and utter curveball. Caves in 2 might be tough, but they've never pulled something like this. A bona fide cave-specific mechanic. One that actually punishes players for being too slow, something the rest of the game never did. A lot of people have said that they wish more caves had a similar punishment in place, and while I do mostly agree with that, I also have to admit it only makes the Water Wraith all the more special. The Water Wraith itself is a hopeless encounter. When your sassy talking ship starts freaking the fuck out upon trying to analyze it, that's how you know you need to get the fuck out. It's invincible, can instantly crush anything with its huge stone rollers, and it's smart. Deceptively smart. They're one of the only enemies in the series capable of freely roaming an area, and if it gets too close, it'll home in on you and give chase until you find a way to lose it. You're forced to rush through its domain, trying to clear sub-levels as fast as possible because the moment you hit 5 minutes on a floor, this eldritch steamroller will drop down and make any remaining work a lot harder to do. For a moment, the game stops being Pikmin 2 and starts resembling Resident Evil 2, and I'm not gonna lie, it's pretty awesome. Yes, it's stressful, yes, it's intense, and yes, it's far from easy to deal with, but that's why I and so many others find it so appealing. It takes the usual spelunking gameplay and turns it on its head. And whenever ghost-type flubber drops down, real genuine fear is felt because you know you can't do anything about it besides running away and praying it'll leave you alone long enough to finish up. All this build-up across 4 deviously designed sub-levels comes to a close on the 5th level where you're blessed with some violet candy pop buds. You figure, what the hey, you've come this far. You let it come down and... it's scared of purple Pikmin? You throw a purple at it, and something about it landing on or near it causes it to completely buckle, forcing it to take a tangible form and finally giving you the ability to fight back. It'll eventually snap out of it, and those rollers can still be a problem, but because it never hides away like other bosses, and because of its very predictable movement and attack strategy, one of the most dangerous and unstoppable monsters in the series suddenly becomes a bit of a joke. And once that health bar reaches 0, the joke only gets funnier. Losing all its health the first time only causes the rollers to shatter, and the Wraith is left with no way to defend itself and starts running away from you with its stubby little legs. The chaser has become the chased, and the satisfaction you get from putting this ethereal prick in their place is some of the strongest you can get from any Pikmin game. All that makes the Water Wraith amazing, and I could see myself bumping it up even further if it stayed in Pikmin 2. Yeah, it's no secret that this guy came back in Pikmin 4, and while I'm glad a whole new generation can be traumatized by it, it's just not the threat it used to be back in 2. It's exactly the same in both behavior and weakness, but all the quality of life features in Ochi have turned the engulfed castle into a breeze. First time I played, I didn't run out the timer once because of how much faster the gameplay is allowed to be in 4. If it had showed up a little sooner, or maybe just had an extra trick up its non-existent sleeves, it probably could have held up much better, but as is, it's been power crept pretty hard. Still, Pikmin 2's Water Wraith is a franchise highlight, and it's enough to carry it this high up the list. In my eyes, the perfect anticlimax boss. It's not about how you start, but how you finish. That's a good saying. Very inspirational, probably helped at least a few people through a rough time in life, and that is admirable, but that phrase does have its limitations in the world of video games. Sorry to say it, but no bad or even mediocre game will miraculously be saved just because it pulled itself together for the finale, especially since most players will likely just bail long before they reach the finish line. With that said, a game's final level or final boss can still have a profound effect on the game, sometimes for the worse, sometimes for the better. And in the latter case, it usually cements a good game as a worthwhile experience. This is important for a game like Pikmin 2 because while it is a very good game, it is also a game that really likes to test your love. It's like that one asshole cat that attacks you out of nowhere and knocks your shit off the table. If you watched my last video, you'll know I had some choice words for how it, let's say, challenged your enjoyment for it. And that's worth mentioning since most of my big problems with it start to surface mid-game and linger till the end. With that in mind, you could always just play till you pay the 10,000 Poco debt and stop there. You even get a credits roll for hitting that milestone, so you could just pretend the game ends here. What could possibly be worth continuing on for? 2 words. Titan Dweevil. I don't think anyone would deny the Titan a spot here. It's the other fan-favorite boss to come out of Pikmin 2, and checks nearly every box for what you would want out of a Pikmin boss battle. You crawled your way down to the depths of the Dream Den, finally found Louie after so much searching, and oh crap, those are long legs. And a very angry weapon-wielding spider attached to them. You sure we can't leave Louie behind? Making a Dweevil the final boss of Pikmin 2 is definitely an odd choice. Sure, they're fairly common, but having one as your final challenge doesn't feel quite as natural as having a Bulborb take up that spot in the first game. But it also makes it quite the unexpected reveal, especially when you see how the Titan Dweevil has evolved beyond its feeble brethren. Other Dweevils just carry around objects and scurry about, but this one not only carries multiple at a time, but can use them as makeshift weapons. Not only is it just a badass sight to behold, but it also gives the Titan some of the best attack variety in the series, and start the trend of Pikmin final bosses having access to most of, if not all, elements in their fights. You've got the short-ranged flare cannon, long-range monster pump, widespread comedy bomb, and the erratic one-hit killer, the Shock Therapist. Each would be a challenge enough on their own, but the fact it can switch between these attacks so efficiently makes it the mother of uphill struggles. You kinda just have to start chucking Pikmin at its weapons to remove them, but that is not gonna happen quickly. Each weapon has 6,000 HP. That's a vague number in a game like this, so let me make it more clear. Remember Empress Bulblax? That fat mound of flesh had 5,000 HP. The Water Wraith? 3 of those things still wouldn't be enough to match just one of these arachnids' armaments. And once you get a weapon at half health, it'll start malfunctioning, which only serves to make them even more dangerous and unpredictable. Of course, if you know Pikmin 2 as well as I do, this boss can be made much less dangerous by simply using whatever yellow Pikmin you have left on you, suddenly making the Shock Therapist the least threatening of the 4 weapons. But that'll end up taking a lot more time considering their average attack power, which just means it gets a whole lot more chances to attack you. And unlike how Rock Pikmin knew to the Plasm Wraith in 3, you can still easily lose to the Dweevil because A, there's no onion right next to the final boss arena, and B, those weapons deal knockback to your captain no matter what, even if you got the upgrades that negate damage from fire and electricity. You can easily get stunned by the flare cannon and especially the monster pump, and if you do, that's a few precious seconds where you can't do anything and you just have to hope your Pikmin will hold on until you can get up and start whistling again. It's a super dangerous boss, probably the single most difficult enemy to fight in 2, but unlike other parts of 2, I don't mind the difficulty since it doesn't rely on cheap tricks to be hard. There's no bombs, no falling boulders, sure there's electricity, but you know the risk of toying around with that by now. If you try fighting this thing while it's still carrying the Shock Therapist with a full squad and eat shit, that's on you. You have to study its behavior, respect its distance at certain points, pay close attention to whatever it's reaching for next, and don't panic. That's what the Titan wants, and if you let it have that, you're done for. Throw on the most layered and intricate boss theme in the franchise, its strangely passive and harmless behavior once it's completely disarmed, and the rather unsettling implication that Louie was in control of the beast the whole time, and you've got a fantastic final boss by Nintendo standards and something in a league well beyond most of Pikmin's offerings. It's interesting to play against, it's interesting to think about, and it's sure as hell interesting to write about. Not bad, Pikmin 2. Not bad at all. Man, we've made it to the very end and Pikmin 4 has yet to make an appearance with one of its own unique creations. Is that a shock? Maybe, but the more you think about it, the more it makes sense. Pikmin 4 is an incredible game, but when you think about its hypothetical priority list of what the developers wanted to do, I wouldn't say that included stacking up an original boss roster with banger fights like Pikmin 3. No, 4 was more interested in bringing back tons of ideas from the first 2 games and fine-tuning them. This included the reintroduction of many iconic bosses that were benched in 2, and especially 3. And while I'm happy to have them back, this did seem to come at the cost of the new faces. Don't get me wrong, the new bosses in 4 are pretty good, but I wouldn't say anything about them goes above and beyond aside from their designs. It did have me a little concerned as I was wrapping up the game. Was the final boss going to suffer that same problem? No. Now die. Let me tell you. Few things in Pikmin have made me shrink in my seat, like Louie yelling at me to go away with his trademark psychotic bug-eyed stare. It's almost like this guy has some serious problems or something, I don't know. And because this game wanted to casually top itself within 30 seconds, I shrank just a little bit more when that massive wall of fur Louie retreated into, turns around, stares you down, and gives you the mother of all roars. And then the rock music kicks in. I don't know what I was expecting, but it wasn't this. I fought my fair share of dogs in games, but the Ancient Sirehound is something so very different. This thing is huge. Like, right up there is one of the largest beasts in the series, and it knows how to use its size. While predictable, its charge and slam attacks are intimidating even when they whiff, because you know you're so unbelievably screwed if it catches you off guard. You have to try and bait it into ramming one of the stalactites it knocks loose during all its rampaging, and that does give you the precious time needed to weigh down its tail and expose its exposed underbelly. It seems like a pretty fun, albeit simple and very easy boss. But then you drain that health bar and things get wild. Not to be outdone by its predecessors, the Sirehound can also channel various elements to make your life a whole lot harder. It can't wield all the elemental types like TD or PW, but the ones it can use are put to good use and complement the canine's impressive bulk. Ice for displacement, electricity for area denial, fire for shockwaves pretty much everywhere, and gloom. You know, that insta-kill goop that exterminates any Pikmin that walk into it regardless of type. Turns out, you don't need to be a premature birth to earn powers of death. That last phase really is the icing on the cake. Unlike even the Titan Dweevil, there's no chi strategy that you can use to circumvent the most dangerous attack. The Sirehound is packing some rancid, apocalyptic breath that you can't do anything about besides just being extremely careful around. Something that's made even more difficult by the breath laser, its ability to fly around, and a roar that will send your battalion scurrying off of Ochi and into those nasty death puddles. Yeah, I kinda got my ass whooped the first time I played this game, but man, it was exhilarating. It's a 5-phase extravaganza that puts you through your paces and leaves you feeling like a Pikmin god when you win. Truly, this is Pikmin 4 operating at its peak potential, and all thanks to Louie. I can't believe I just said that. This has been Baleography, and I wish you all my very best. The the vehem the the the, the fucking god the behemoth fossil the ve the ve the ve god, oh, this is gonna be rough. The thank god I'm calling this thing Venomoth for the rest of the script.